So I guess this is a video nobody asked for, which is why I'm going to make it. I wanted to talk a little bit about my experience with Pokemon, the card game, Magic the Gathering, the card game. Why? I don't know. I honestly don't even know what brought this up in my mind, but a handful of years ago, in fact, 10 years ago at this point, which is crazy to think about, I had gotten back into playing Pokemon cards because I was in school and I was very far from home at that point. And so I didn't have a whole lot to do, but one thing I still had was a little bit of a Pokemon card collection. And so I had my sister send it to me in the mail. And once it arrived, I also took some of my money to a mall that was kind of nearby and bought my first Pokemon deck in what had to have been 15 years at least. I honestly don't know. So the deck that I bought, I don't remember the name of it, but it included one card specifically. If you're familiar with Pokemon decks, starter decks specifically, they usually include just 2 rares, nothing fancy, but this was one of the cards. And this is one that fascinated me because, as you can see, the power on it, Deluge, is actually quite useful. Well, I ended up designing a deck around this card using some of the cards I had. Now, we were playing unlimited because this was a dorm. We didn't really care too much about like going with standard or anything like that. Just whatever cards you had, so long as they didn't like absolutely bust the game, we were fine with it, right? Generally speaking, I went ahead and I built a deck that was only water, nothing else. I mean, there were a couple other cards that appeared in there that weren't water type, but they all played into this effect specifically because the deck was about one thing. Just winning. And it did that a lot. If I remember correctly, went either 31 or 32 matches undefeated before finally facing my first ever defeat. And it was through a friend of mine who used my own strategy against me. And I also had designed a second deck to take on this deck specifically. Anyway, what was the purpose of this? Well, essentially, in a nutshell, it was to just overpower like everything quickly. Right? It was designed to get these Blastoise on the field as fast as possible. There were 2 of this version of Blastoise, and there was 1 of this version, which I actually got from a friend who I had traded, I don't know, something else for. Anyway, point being, I wasn't looking for this card, but he traded me like a stack of cards, and this was in it. Obviously, this Pokemon power has a bit of synergy with the previous one, right? So, generally speaking, both of these are very strong cards, but one thing that you'll see that they do is oftentimes throw energies either into the discard pile or, in the case of the Hydro Pump here, obviously doing more damage with no limit based on the amount of energies that's currently on it, right? So, that's great, right? This deck's strategy is get as many energies onto the field as possible and buff these guys up quickly, while also getting these guys out on the field as fast as possible. So I had things to help them evolve faster. I had ways to get like energies out of the discard pile or draw them out of the deck or put them into the discard pile so I could get them back later. Or if I did discard them, I could get them back, so on and so forth, right? It relied on several different cards, and I'm trying to remember this all from memory, by the way. So some of these may be incorrect, but I do recognize these images, I'm pretty sure. This was another one that was in there just because, yeah, it's not a Blastoise, but it still has some strong attacks, and if you look, it's just a stage 1 evolution, not a stage 2. Now, obviously, it combats that by needing 5 energies for Hydro Splash. But again, in a deck that was, I think, like 16 or something, I've counted it, it's been a while, but a lot more energies than you would normally see in a typical deck. It also relied on cards like this to draw energies off of the top of the deck because I had another card that would allow me to organize the top of my deck in a specific way. Again, I don't remember all of it, but I do remember having the Sableye here. I remember having an Aron in the deck, which is a steel type for various reasons, but generally it was a water deck. All the energies in it were water with the sake of 1 rainbow energy. And this Magikarp specifically, which, is pretty overpowered. 30 health is not great. This is one of the earliest Magikarp cards we ever got, but Rapid Evolution is insane because it's like, oh, you just killed all of my Squirtles or whatever, and maybe I can't get them back for some reason. I don't have the card in hand. Well, this Magikarp's going to do the job for me, right? Again, I don't have a million different ways to win. It's not an unbeatable deck by any means, but it was really strong. And that's why I just kind of fell out of love with playing the game, because the deck was nearly undefeatable. It wasn't literally, but given the cards that existed at the time and the pool of cards that we all had access to, no one else really stood a chance against this thing, which is why I had designed that second deck in in the first place. It was a grass psychic deck, and I know it relied on like Mewtwo, and it did specific damage based, I think it was an EX Mewtwo or something, and it did damage based on the amount of energies on your opponent's card active Pokemon, whatever the case may be. Anyway, so because this deck was pretty decent, I got bored of playing it. So I decided I wanted to try something new. Now, as a kid, I'd played a little bit of Yu-Gi-Oh! In the past, but we had some people at the school that were lovely people, but way too into the rules of Yu-Gi-Oh! That would carry around like rule cards, and like matches would last like an hour or 2 hours or 3 hours. No. So instead, I wanted to try this new thing. I had never played Magic before. My brother was a huge collector of Magic back in like the 90s and early 2000s and stuff, but I had never played it. I'd never got into it, didn't know how it worked. And so I tried. My very first deck that I ever made was trash, by the way. If you don't know how Magic is played, I really like it because it affords a lot of control to the designer of their deck. A lot of people take it very seriously, and that's fine. It's not my thing. I actually like just having fun with Magic specifically. So I love actually going out of my way and designing decks that are kind of kooky. My first deck, though, was 111 cards. It was trash, like I said, but at the very least, it did have some cohesion with it. But this is my first time creating this, so I shoved a lot of cards in there like, oh, well, this one's good, this one's good, this one's good, without having a lot of synergy with themselves. A little bit. There was a hint of something there. There was a spark of something there, and I did win a couple of games with it when I, by all means, shouldn't have. At the very least, though, it was a trash deck. So I finally set aside some time to try and make something good, limiting myself to 60 cards. I believe my first deck ever relied on Life Gain and Soul Bond, which was a card that, if I remember correctly, like beefs up the power of your creature that it's attached to based on how much life you gain, right? So it's a synergistic relationship. Anyway, it was a fine deck to play, but if it got defeated early, it didn't stand a chance in the long game, right? If it did take off, though, then it just annoyed people, and I didn't like that. So instead, what I did is I went out of my way to buy one of those like $20 deck builders toolkit things. And I know that they're not like the best value in the world, but I loved what I got out of it. It was a 2015, I think, or 2014 core, whatever the case may be. I know it's like a year ahead or whatever. Anyway, point being though, I got one card out of it that was not great, don't get me wrong, but it was very good for me specifically. So before I had got this, or roughly around the same time I got this deck builders toolkit, I also bought myself a pre-built deck for Magic, and it involved 2 dragon cards specifically. Again, this was back in 2014. I don't remember what the name of the deck was, but the 2 dragons in it were the Hoarding Dragon and the Siege Dragon. And if you know what those cards are, they're fine. You know, they're dragon cards, nothing fancy going on there. But what the Hoarding Dragon did specifically, and what I really liked, was that it allowed me to pull an artifact out of my deck. And when I opened up that deck builder's toolkit, I also got this. This is what inspired my next deck. Now, this was not an undefeatable deck, don't get me wrong. But when it worked really well. And I was very excited for it because this was the very first deck that I had ever made. And I did get a lot of compliments for it because, hey, it's neat. It does fun things. This was a deck that I designed that wasn't like an early game, mid game, or late game deck because I didn't really know what any of that stuff was at the time. So it wasn't control, it wasn't aggro, it wasn't anything like that. It was kind of a mix. And it did this in a way that was very synergistic by basically breaking the deck down into 3 parts. It was an Is It deck, so it was red and blue. And it focused around this card, but at the time I only owned 1 copy of this. So how could I beef up my chances of drawing this out of 60 cards? Well, Hoarding Dragon was one way. Luckily for me, 2 of the other people that I went to school with who had also played Magic and also had bought booster packs and things along the same time I did, had also pulled some Hoarding Dragons. It wasn't a terribly uncommon card. And so I traded off for those. Don't remember what I traded. I think a Planeswalker or something like that because I wasn't a big fan of Planeswalkers at the time. Didn't know how they worked, and I didn't have a deck that was built around one of them I had. Don't worry, it wasn't an expensive one anyway. But I wouldn't have known that. And it didn't matter because I derived my value from the fun I was having with the cards, not the value of the cards themselves. That said, Hoarding Dragon, if you read it, is a perfectly serviceable card. I mean, it's a 5, card for a 4/4 flying dragon. It's fine. For a dragon, all things considered, it's not the most expensive thing in the world. Some dragons can get to be kind of expensive to cast. But generally speaking, obviously, you read the effect that the card has. That's why I played it. So then next, what happens if I play this card early? Or if I want to ramp up how fast I can play this card? Well, there was another card out around the same time, the Generator Servant. I don't know what that symbol is, but, you know, the Generator Servant specifically. And if you read it, it's a pretty simple card to understand too. You pay 2 energy in, and you tap it and sacrifice it. You get 2 energy back out of it. It's basically an energy store card, but it ends up working well because it can ramp in a color like red, which is generally not a thing that red is known for. It can, you know, there are other cards that do it, but it's relatively rare. And I want to mention too that when I built this deck, it was standard legal as well. I didn't know that at the time, but hey, you know, it wasn't unlimited. We weren't playing with, anyway. So I go ahead, I build this deck around a full set of 4 of these, I believe, so that I can get these cards out more quickly. And then what I do with that Scuttling Doom Engine is I use another card called Fling. Fling is very simple. You just sacrifice one of your creatures and you deal damage to your opponent based on that creature's attack power. Well, that's easy enough, right? Because I can use it and I can get this Generator Servant out pretty quickly. I use Fling, I throw the Hoarding Dragon, and that allows me to automatically sacrifice it and thus get the Scuttling Doom Engine. And I can get this out. I think my deck was capable of getting this card out on turn 4 at its fastest. Maybe it was turn 3. Point being, though, that's a really strong card to play on turn 3, all things considered, in standard for a newbie like myself, right? A 6/6, but obviously I was playing this for the effect. It's also worth noting, too, that with the Generator Servant, it gives haste to the creatures that you use to summon it. So this would come into the field and be able to attack on the same turn, which is pretty powerful. If you have a 6/6 that's able to attack on the turn it hits the field, oftentimes, at least with the group that I was playing with, because not all of us were terribly serious about this game, I was going to get a hit in for free, right? A 6/6 hit, sure, I'll take it. And then if I wanted to next turn, or if I had enough lands on the field that turn, I could fling it and win the game by turn 4 or turn 5 or whatever. However, obviously, as a strategy, it still is subject to a lot of other cards, other attacks, other whatever, targeting, etc. Exile, obviously, for example, on this, that was a very popular target for Exile. So, like I said, this only requires a few cards for this portion of the deck to work. So I didn't stack the deck into this completely, right? I didn't get a full set of 4 of these Scuttling Doom Engines. They're very expensive cards to play, right? So then what I relied on next was another card that came in my deck, Ornithopter, right here. It's a 0-cost card for a 0/2. Doesn't do anything that special on its own. I mean, a flying 0/2 blocker for free is pretty fine, you know. But you put it on with this, and suddenly on turn 2, you could potentially have a 5/5 flying creature. That's terrifying, right? So this was really good, and I believe this was also in the deck that I got as well, because it did have a little bit of an artifact focus in it. But again, I couldn't tell you for sure if that was the case, because again, it's been years. Siege Dragon, if you read what it does 2 damage to creatures if your player that you're attacking controls no walls, which is actually pretty decent. So I paired this with Polymorphous Just, and what that does is it turns all of your opponent's creatures into 1/1 frogs, I believe. So it takes away all of their other abilities, which means that this can just board wipe any attack you want. Not literally any, because again, that's, you know, Polymorphous Just, I think, is a 1-turn thing, but generally speaking, not too bad. And again, just 2 cards there. 2 cards with the synergy between the Ornithopter and this. And then lastly, because I call it my dragons deck, I did stack it with some bigger dragons, because if I had those Hoarding Dragons in the deck, but say my, you know, Scuttling Doom Engine was exiled, or it wasn't enough to take out a creature, I've still got dragons in the deck, right? Might as well take advantage of them, right? So this is obviously one that's synergistic with those dragons. There is this one, which is synergistic with those dragons as well. Both of those did really well. Obviously, I stacked some very small dragons in the deck too, like a dragon's egg. And there was another one that was like a 3-cost dragon, or maybe a 2-cost. I don't remember. Point being, it wasn't bad, right? I only had 1 copy of each of these, but this was kind of late game stuff for this. And then lastly, the Thundermaw Hellkite, which I also traded for, ended up actually becoming a relatively expensive card, but at that time it obviously wasn't. And yeah, so it was pretty cool, all things considered. And this was my foray into Magic. Magic, like I said, is a game that I quite enjoy. if only because it affords so much control to the creator of the deck, right? They get to kind of choose what game they're looking for. With Pokemon, a lot of the times when you play the game is played the same. You verse different people, you have different interactions each time, sure, but the game, the way it is set up, the way the rules play out is generally the same. However, with Magic, you can play the game extremely competitive, or you can toy with people if that's your thing, or you can just have fun with it, build, you know, half-hearted decks like this one. This one still succumbs to a lot of issues, don't get me wrong. I didn't get it right on my first try, but even when I showed this to one of my friends who had actually played Magic on the tournament level, he was like, I can see what you're going for here. Like, this is actually pretty decent. Here are a couple ways that you can improve this deck. I don't even think I ever did end up improving it either. I tried, obviously, I added other things to it. But generally speaking, this first deck build, if you will, is the one that I spent the most time on. I think I spent 8 hours designing the deck from start to finish. Again, first deck, I didn't know all the cards that existed, so of course it took me some time. But generally speaking, it just did what I needed it to do. Did it win every time? No, absolutely not. But did I have fun playing it? So much. That's why I remember it so much. I can tell you, like I said, I had a Soul Bond deck, and I think it was like something Pegasus or something that it relied on. But I couldn't tell you just about any of the other cards that were in that deck. I know that there were like a Planeswalker. Who's the big lion guy? Ajani? Yeah. There was one of those in there, and I think that was all I can remember about that deck. I can't remember anything about the 111 card very first deck I ever made. But this one, I can remember almost everything about it, in much the same way as I can remember almost everything about that water Pokemon deck. In the case of the water Pokemon deck, it's because I was very proud of it, but I was very bored of it. I played it so many times, and so many people wanted to battle me, right? This, on the other hand, I just felt very proud of, not because it was a perfect winner, but because it did what I wanted it to do. It balanced things pretty nicely. And it's really the first time I've played even a deck like this, where it sort of structures itself into playing the game sort of quick, but sometimes mid-game, but sometimes late game. Obviously, some of those dragons are very expensive. Anyway, getting ahead of myself here. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. Helps the channel get closer to 4,000, our next milestone. And of course, as always, you can check out the Instagram, Discord, and Patreon, all of which are down in the description below. But let me know your thoughts. Have you ever played Pokemon? Have you played Yu-Gi-Oh? Have you played Magic? And if so, what do you remember? What is your fondest memory? Is it cracking open a booster pack when you were a kid? Is it something from just a few years ago? Did you ever revisit it? Did you have a dark age? Let me know those ones in the comments, or take that conversation further on Discord, and I'll see you all in the next one. Take care.